Okay, this section of notes will be called Post-Reconstruction. Here are our post-Reconstruction presidents. We're going to go over these individually, but just to show them, we have U.S. Grant, number 18, and we'll start with him first. Ulysses Simpson Grant, U.S. Grant. He was a Republican. He served 2 terms. As we know, he was a Civil War hero. He fought for the Union, obviously. Not your typical soldier. He did go to West Point, graduated about middle of his class. He was actually at one point forced out of the Army for excessive drinking. But when Lincoln asked for volunteers when the Civil War began, he immediately volunteered. So he enlisted. His real name is actually Hiram Ulysses Grant. Hiram. His initials would have been Hug. Imagine that on a military locker. Hug. He actually was changed incorrectly and accidentally by a congressman who put down Simpson, which was his mother's maiden name, as his middle name, and lost the first name, Hiram. So that's where U.S. Grant came from, and he just went with it. He actually hated the military life. He wasn't your typical soldier. He believed it was too disciplined. And if you look up in this picture, this is a typical picture of Grant. Hair's kind of messed up. Uniform a little wrinkly. Noted for his drinking, but it wasn't that he was an alcoholic or anything. Just he had trouble over drinking. He couldn't hold his booze, in other words. So he kind of got that reputation of being a heavy drinker. Remember, we talked about this before, that he was actually invited to go to Ford's Theater with Abraham Lincoln and his wife, but he had promised his wife that he would go home that night, and might have saved his life, because as we know, John Wilkes Booth was actually planning on killing Grant as well. So probably saved his life. Now, as we know, great military leader, credited with winning the Civil War. His tactics were often questioned because of the number of casualties he took, but still a war hero nonetheless. As a president, different story. His nickname as a president is going to be Useless Grant. His presidency is just laden with scandals. And it wasn't that he was corrupt himself, but it was the people around him. Okay, in fact, his cabinet was often called the whiskey cabinet, because it was a bunch of his drinking buddies, and frankly, they took advantage of him. Okay, the biggest one is the credit mobilier scandal, and basically this was all around the railroads. Okay, the Transcontinental Railroad is being built, and the scandals that engulfed his presidency were basically centered around the railroads. The Union Pacific, which was being built from the west, from Missouri to Omaha. Also the Central Pacific being built from the east, from Sacramento. And basically the Credit Mobilier was in charge of building these, and they kept getting the grants to build these. And we find out later that it was because there were bribes being sent. Okay, the man or the company that owned Credit Mobilier and Union Pacific were the same. So they're owned by the same people. Not that that's illegal, but the problem was that they kept getting these contracts, and it was found out that they were basically bribing people to get those contracts. That's where the legality comes into play here. The government officials that were bribed, it went all the way up to the vice president. Schuyler Colfax was almost impeached over his role in this. Okay, he would be Grant's first term vice president, and then obviously Grant gets rid of him, and Henry Wilson will be the second guy. Also, the Secretary of Treasury, he takes over almost $200,000 in bribes. The Secretary of Navy Secretary of War accepted $24,000 in bribes. Secretary of the Navy took bribes from shipbuilders. And the Secretary of the Interior was involved in a huge scandal around the railroads once again by taking money from the land sales. The Secretary of the Interior knew where the railroads were going to go, tipped off the congressmen, and many congressmen were involved in this, tipped off the congressmen where the railroad was going to go. The congressmen would then buy that land up, waiting for the government to come buy the land from them, because that's where they're going to put the railroad. So, and it went all the way down to state and local officials as well. So this is going to rock U.S. Simpson Grant's presidency. However, a lot of it doesn't come out until it's too late. I mean, he serves 2 terms. Okay. Another example of a scandal at the time is a salary grab. Congress voted itself a retroactive pay raise during Grant's administration, where they would give themselves a raise dating back 2 years. Okay, almost $5,000 to $7,500 over a 2-year period, and that's quite a bit of money. But the idea of that even happening, going back and giving yourself a raise the past 2 years and taking that money, this would actually be repealed. But still, the idea that they came up with that. And then Grant's salary was doubled during this time, $25,000 to $50,000. So yeah, it just looks bad. Here is Grant's caricature page. You can see some of the facts here. Not a very big guy, 5'7". This picture here is drawn because he was actually pulled over. That's what this story is about. Pulled over when he was president for speeding in his carriage. He used to race his horse and buggy through the parks there. First president to have both parents alive when taking office. First president to have a female opponent, Victoria Woodhull. And that's interesting because she wasn't even allowed to vote for herself. Let's see. We talked about hug. I think we're good there. All right, so after Grant's presidency, we have the election of 1876. Okay? This election is going to be very important as far as Reconstruction goes, because this is going to end this Reconstruction period. We have Sam Tilden. He was the governor of New York. He was a Democrat going against Rutherford B. Hayes, governor of Ohio. Kind of a close election even leading up, but then we're going to see something pretty controversial is going to happen. And just to review here, when we have a presidential election, everybody votes. The popular vote does matter. It does count, but we don't directly elect a president with the popular vote. The president is elected through an electoral process. And basically, the popular vote in that state determines who will get all the electoral votes for that state. So, for instance, let's say Barack Obama won Ohio by 1 vote using the popular vote, and he gets all of the, I believe we have 18 electoral votes in Ohio. He'll get all 18 of those electoral votes. So that's how this is determined. So remember that. That's important. The result, Tilden actually wins 250,000 more popular votes than Rutherford B. Hayes. But remember, he needs 185 electoral votes at this point to win the election. And he only has 184. And Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, has 165. So he doesn't have the majority of those electoral votes. And there's another little twist here. Okay? In most cases, this would go to the House of Representatives, and they would decide. But in this case, 4 states gave 2 sets of electoral votes because of all the things that were going on down south, and with the Reconstruction Plan, 4 states will actually give 2 sets of votes. Those states will be Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. So those 4 states sent in 2 sets of electoral votes. And it comes down to who's going to count them. Because obviously with 2 sets, they're probably picking different presidents. The Constitution states that if the president of the Senate shall open the votes in the presence of both houses, but it doesn't say who counts them. And if the Senate counts them, it would favor the Republicans, which would be Hayes. If the House counted them, it would favor the Democrats, which would be Tilden. So they decided to create a committee of 15 men to decide the presidency. Okay? There's 20 electoral votes out there. So if Hayes won all 20, he would have 185, he'd win. If Tilden would just win one of those, he would win. So they come up with the committee. Okay? There were 15 people on this committee. 5 senators, 5 representatives in the House, and then 5 justices from the Supreme Court. 7 would be Republicans, 7 would be Democrats, and there would be 1 independent. They're trying to keep it even. Okay? And this committee, I believe I have a picture. Here's the committee down here. Okay? The committee is going to decide the presidency. The only problem is that the independent was on the Supreme Court. He actually resigned because he was appointed to the Senate in Illinois due to a death. So now they have to find somebody else. And there weren't any other Supreme Court justices that were independent, and there were only Republicans left. So they chose that last Republican, and that kind of swayed the committee. So they did reach a compromise. Okay, the problem was that even if this committee chose Hayes as president, which the numbers would suggest, that the Democrats could still hold this up in the House and just negate the whole thing. So they did come up with a compromise. And Hayes wins the presidency. He was elected. But, as you could probably guess, do you think Hayes was going to be a popular president? I mean, he lost the popular vote. Similar to what we saw with George W. Bush in the beginning. You know, George W. Bush also lost the popular vote. So, he wasn't necessarily a popular president. In fact, they called him Rutherford Hayes. And because there's so many problems with this. This has come to known as the Compromise of 1877. Okay, and basically this was done behind closed doors, and the Compromise of 1877 basically did a couple things. Okay, number one, it pulled all the remaining federal troops from the southern states. So all those troops that we talked about, if you remember in the last lecture we talked about you had to ratify the 14th Amendment to be readmitted into a state. And if not, the military was going to take over your state. So that's over with now. Okay, all those federal troops are pulled from the southern states. Number two, it agreed to give huge subsidies to the southern railroads. So trying to rebuild the South. So basically what this did is it allowed those old southern governments back into the political system. And it was a way for the Democrats to regain control of the southern politics. So those carpetbag governments down south are done. They're out. And this marked the end of Reconstruction. This marked the end of Reconstruction. Compromise of 1877, along with the election of 1876, is the end of Reconstruction. So very important. So obviously they made a deal. You can have the presidency, but we're going to get our southern governments back. And they agreed. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes, as president, he actually went to Harvard. Yes, Harvard. He moved to Cincinnati to practice law. He actually met his wife, Lucy, in Chillicothe, Ohio. He was also a military general in the Civil War. He was actually wounded 5 times, very respected by his men. He was elected to the House while he was still in the Army. He didn't even campaign, just his name alone. And when he was governor, he did a great job. And his nickname, Lemonade Lucy, his wife's nickname, actually was given to his wife because she pressured the president to ban booze from the White House. So that's where that nickname comes. She would not serve alcohol in the White House. And she had this idea called the Ohio idea. The Ohio idea, which is basically banning of alcohol in the White House, and then obviously, hopefully people would catch on with that. Okay. Now, what he was most known for was this election. Okay, but he did do some things. Okay, he actually fought the spoil system. The spoil system. The spoil system is what Grant did. Grant put all his buddies in the cabinet, put all his buddies in high positions. Hayes fights that. He wants a merit system. Basically, it's based on your qualifications. I know that seems odd that we even have to discuss this, but that's how things were done back then. So Grant had the spoil system. Hayes has the merit system based on your qualifications, which is totally opposite from what Grant did. However, like we said, his presidency wasn't a strong one. Okay, lots of unrest, railroad strikes, troops were sent into many cities, and Hayes wasn't a very popular president to begin with. So it came down to the next election. Oh, there's his caricature here. Very hard-working, honest man. First president to use a telephone. First to visit the West. Only president elected after losing the popular vote. That is incorrect now because we know George W. Bush was part of that. So this is a little bit dated. And there he is running to the phone carrying his lemonade. There's Lucy. Hello. James Garfield, meow. The election of 1880 is our next president. Okay, he's also from Ohio. His vice president will be Chester A. Arthur, which will be important. Grew up in poverty on an Ohio farm. Another general in the Civil War, and in 1863 won a seat in Congress. Becomes very influential in the Republican Party, but he had some of his own problems. Okay, he'll go against General Winfield Scott Hancock in the election and wins pretty easy. Well, I shouldn't say that. Wins by about 7,000 popular votes, but won the electoral vote 214 to 155. So not as much drama in here, although pretty close. His problem was his indecisiveness. Okay, he actually reverted back to the spoil system, and many of his problems were caused by that. He was constantly bothered by office seekers, people that wanted a job. And he actually said, I'm considering all day whether A or B shall be appointed to this office or that. And he actually had another quote about the office. My God, what is there in this place that a man should ever want to get into it? Unfortunately for Garfield, his presidency will be cut short. July of 1881, a man named Charles Guiteau was disappointed that he did not get an office from Garfield and shot him in the back in at the railroad station, at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. Garfield would linger until September, but would eventually succumb to his wounds. And Chester A. Arthur becomes president. And that's where we'll stop today. Oh, actually, let's go. I want to show you a picture of Charles Guiteau. Almost forgot that. There's a picture of Guiteau. Here's a drawing of the assassination, and here's the picture of the gun that was used as well. And there's Garfield's caricature. First left-handed president, and he actually worked on the Erie Canal, which is what he's doing here in Caddo.